Thank you so much for joining us, Mukhtara. And I'm really, really happy to welcome you here today.
Thank you, May. Um, I feel like before we jump in, I really want to kind of acknowledge um, some things. Like you said, I'm an indigenous Yoruba person, and I think although a lot of the conversations about decolonizing end up being really political and theoretical, um, and our conversation will go into a lot of theory and politics, like the reality is that so much of the call to this work and the need to do this work is grounded in our human experience, our feelings. Um, so I have a lot of like really deep joy and gratitude for being here. Um, I'm really grateful to be here. I'm really grateful that so many people from my community, so many people that pour into me, that make me able, like emotionally, to do this work, that sustain me to do this work, invested their time in being inside of this space. And I feel like the flip side of that joy and gratitude is also pain and grief and trauma, right? That's such a huge aspect of my work. And it's because I believe that acknowledging our pain and our grief and our trauma makes space for joy, but that is also deeply, deeply, deeply important for marginalized people, for Black and Indigenous people to create space for the acknowledgement of their emotional selves, because that is part of the fissuring of ourselves that has happened through colonialism. And before we had this talk, I've been trying to figure out like the language to trying to find the words to express my pain and grief and trauma in this moment while my country is going through something that is, yeah, very difficult for lack of a better term, something that is deeply traumatic for us as a nation. And I couldn't quite find anything, but I got these words in my inbox this morning from an artist, a Nigerian artist. His name is Adekunle Gold. And so I just want to read some of that as an acknowledgement of that space, and what we're going through as a people, what Indigenous Nigerians are going through as a people right now. As our timelines slowly go back to how it was, it might be easy to assume that we are numb and we've moved on. But you and I know deep down in our hearts that even though they are working overtime to deny and spin this horrific event, we can never go back to how it used to be. We have lost people, we have lost a lot, and we are all awake. As we are awake, I hope that you are finding comfort in something positive. For me, it is in the fact that the leaders at the top know their time is up and that you and I will see the future we imagine of our nation. I'm finding comfort in hoping till hoping leads to fresh action. I pray for peace for you that leaves you dumbfounded and a hope that can never be crushed. Um, I believe so much in the sovereignty of Indigenous people globally, and I just really want to express my grief and my presence in that grief with the people who have lost their loved ones during this political uprising in Nigeria that is really at its heart about us as Indigenous people being able to have sovereignty over our lives and over our futures. Um, and is really deeply about a call for healing, for for healing the trauma that our ancestors felt when they woke up one day and were absorbed and swallowed into this nation state that was put together for nothing else than for Europeans to reap an economic benefit. And so, yeah, that's, I think that longstanding feeling of understanding myself as an Indigenous self and understanding my body as part of Indigenous Yoruba land is so at the core of my work. And we can use that to transition into me sharing a bit of those images and visualizations from my work. Okay. So let's see. So my work moves across community engagement, found material, clothing, textile, digital landscape and textile, and archive. A lot of the way that I would describe my work and myself and kind of the efforts to decolonize within my work is as neo-Indigenous animism. And animism is this through line inside of my work, right? The idea that things that we often have been told to consider objects are alive and are living, is really this ongoing theme. And I think actually not just a theme, but an ethos inside of my work. And for me, the power in that is that animism is such a huge part of Indigenous knowledge, right? Animism, inside of Indigenous knowledge, so much of it is about what it means to honor and acknowledge the land, what it means to honor and acknowledge the life force and the existence of non-human others, to acknowledge them as alive and having power. And this is one of the core things that inside of colonialism and coloniality, right? Like the philosophical aspects and the epistemological aspects of colonialism that has been stripped and discredited. Like it was one of the first ways that colonizers were discrediting our existence and our knowledge as valid subjects. It's like, well, you don't see yourself as separate, or these people still believe, these native people still believe that the trees have a life force, that the trees are alive, or this wood statuette has a life, etc. And I think that there's something between the separation that is made between subjects and objects that also leads in so many ways for us to understand the globalness of coloniality, right? So anti-Blackness, the history of anti-Blackness and chattel slavery, to me is so deeply based in dehumanization and objectification that is founded on the idea that some human beings are not subjects, but they're objects. And so in my work, that brings me to really try to disturb this divide in and of itself. What happens if we see all entities that exist as subjects? Or what happens when we move on to kind of like an ethic that says that no matter whether an entity is a subject or an object, it deserves to be honored and it deserves reverence. And it has a power, it has an energy, it has an activation, it is doing things, really reframes and kind of makes us rethink design in and of itself, right? I really believe that so much of the power of design, or so much of the ideas that a lot of contemporary designers have about their status and their power as designers is so deeply grounded in the idea that we are subjects and we are making objects, and we're in control of these objects that we make. And these objects also give us control, but the reality, I believe, is way more unruly than that. And it deals with interaction, and it deals with ecologies. So that being said, interaction is one of the big themes inside of my work. So one example of that is my textile work, my weaving work. This piece, actually these two pieces I'll show you, are interactive textile pieces that I wove that play with and explore the idea of animism that's present already in indigenous technologies, and uses interactive technology to like play that up, and to also collapse the divide, right, between our idea of like animism as this primitive thing and scientific, like Western scientific technology as this thing that is more advanced and different. And here you like with this object, or with this textile, the textile comes alive and interacts in different ways depending on the lighting conditions that it's in. Let's see. And then this is the case similarly with this textile, which is playing on animism, and the animism of that is present in Islamic metaphysics, for lack of a better word. So this idea of the power of verses from the Quran themselves to activate and to make something happen. So this is the textile interaction of that piece that is light reactive to specific condition. And then so the ecology part of this is thinking about indigenous and indigeneity as being connected to the land. When I was first making this piece, I thought about how my ancestors wove using the resources from the ground. In that case, it was cotton, but resources from the ground now, in my country, in Lagos and in Ibadan, are include plastic waste, right? So this piece is woven from plastic waste, and me really trying to consider and think about the life cycles and the livelihood of so-called objects. Like, where do they come from? Where do they start? How do we continue their lives? Are these, for example, plastic bags made, which is why I used to weave here, made to, and are their lives ended too early? Is this a form of reincarnation for them? And I think when thinking about the materiality of plastic, it gets really deep for me, because I think about dispossession of land in Nigeria that has led to the petroleum industry there, the dispossession of indigenous land, and what that means for those people, and how that is really so much of a factor inside of plastic production, right? And the use of land for exploitative means. So there's a way by which I tend to think about plastic as a haunting, the plastic waste issue that is present now as a haunting. So these are some of those, like playing with those ideas, and also looking at trying to break down the different ecologies inside the weaving pieces. Oh, I closed the screen. I want to switch to this, or I want to continue on to this bit about subjectivity, and how the animism leads me to thinking about subjects in design quite differently, as a decolonial method. But I also want to give space for like us to like engage a bit on what I've just said, and potentially if people have questions, for them to put that in the chat box as well,
Yeah,
instead of me to just go.
I think that's great. So yeah, if anyone has questions, feel free to pop them in the chat at any point, and we'll try to pick up on them. I guess I have a few thoughts. I wanted to kind of go back to some of the things you said about interaction.
Mm.
And I think that might be a thread, metaphorically and literally, that we that we pick up on it at a different point. But I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that light reactive piece, and what it means for you when you're thinking about using something that's then going to be responsive to the material conditions that it's in. What that means. I mean, on some level, I can understand that as you know, I suppose that's just like a technology, as you said. But there's also, I think it's really important to think about all the different understandings of what technology means, because again, what's understood as a technology can be quite limited. And I know in English, yeah, in English studies, we talk about language, written language as a technology. So like writing an inscription can be a form of, that was sort of Walter Ong's idea that literacy is a technology, writing is a technology, and as such, it has many of the drawbacks potentially that we could also associate with technology. So I wonder if you could just speak to that and what it means to have something be interactive, and what you mean by kind of indigenous technology and how that comes out in your work.
Yeah. So technology in and of itself, right? I'm like looking at the epistemology of like techne and all these things. Technology has really, I guess, my understanding of what it is and what I define as technology has really grown and shifted. Sorry, has really grown and shifted. I think that, as you rightly said, like the word technology is usually used to describe something that is thought of as part of Western science, like period, right? Um, and for me, it's really been important to, yeah, just mess with that. Like most often I describe my work as in like exploring indigenous technology, or me exploring, because there's a way. Okay, so in Yoruba divination, right, there is, I won't go too into it, but we use in Ifa, there's a plate that is used. There's a plate and there's a computational system, but it's not called that, or it's not thought of as that, right? It operates completely on binary code, because you can only get one of two outcomes. It's like the same thing as how a computer works, just with zeros and twos, right? So to me, part of a decolonial effort is really undoing the separation between that and so-called Western, right? Because this is how, like epistemologically, that all the harms of coloniality were created and continue. The idea that Native people are backwards and they have not been brought into modernity, right? Indigenous people have not been brought into modernity. Their primitive existence is here, and our modernity as imperialists is here, and so we need to drag them along, this very linear vision. And so I'm like, yeah, not that, right? Basically, not that. And technology as something that does something,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
So the reason really for playing with those like those things that are understood more easily as part of technology is to disrupt their separation from the animism, like using them in indigenous contexts. And I will say too that, you know, a lot of my work is informed by object-oriented ontology and the work of like people like Latour and Donna Haraway and Heidegger and all these folks, but I'm also very simultaneously suspicious of their lack of acknowledgement that all these theories and paradigms and ways of thinking about so-called objects have existed for centuries and centuries within indigenous theology, right? There's like I have yet to see, oh, Ingold is another one. I've yet to see the acknowledgement of the fact that they're basically remixing a lot of this stuff as post-humanism. So I hope that answers the question somewhat.
Yeah, it's great. And we've got a lot of really wonderful comments in the chat too. Okay, this is an interesting question. We have some questions about plastic. So there was this initial comment, plastic waste as a haunting is so on point. And then there's this other question for you. Do you think the plastic represents an alien presence in animism or a perversion of indigenous resources? And I think that's a really interesting one because, you know, it gets into the whole life cycle of plastic. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, sure. That's a really good question. So I am, or have been, where do I start? So when I think about plastic, I think about, like I said, it's the beginning of its life as petrol, right? Like as petroleum, and the beginning of that as fossil fuel, right? Literally like geological past, the remains of organisms. And in that way, we can think of them as ancestors, right? Like those who have been here before us, being inside of the earth. And in some ways, so yeah, definitely, like there are ways by which I think about the production itself as a perversion of indigenous resources. And I think that that's an important distinction because then it pulls it back to the ecology of how plastic is made, right? For me, I'm like, okay, plastic, cool, fossil fuels, okay. I'm like, okay, Niger Delta, and then it just falls apart. Like the ecology of how those indigenous people have had their land taken from them, how it has cost them their lives, fighting the dispossession of their land. So I'm like, it's really to me about the story of that. There's so many, and this is also petroplastic, right? Like I don't want to lob everything together. There's so many different forms of plastic that are not, they're not harmful in this way, and their ecologies are maybe a bit less violent, maybe not. But so I feel like that's a big thing. I imagine like the life of plastic, like as a material. What is a good life for plastic? What is a way of producing plastic that does not involve trauma? And like obviously there's the production part, but there's this way by which like we really misunderstand it as a material, right? So I won't go into it too much, but I have been lucky enough to work really wonderfully with a kind of incubator. I don't really know what else to call it, but basically a group of us thinking together really deeply about materials. And for one of our presentations, someone embodied plastic and did an interview as misunderstood plastic, right? Plastic as like having a bad rep and a bad name. And actually the things that we don't like about plastic are not necessarily inherent to it. It's part of how we use it. So the fact that plastic does not disappear, or it takes however many billion years or whatever for it to biodegrade, would not be an issue if we weren't producing it in such masses, right? Or if we were producing it for things that were so precious and so rare to us that we expect them to last forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, right? Like an heirloom or something. So I think really the perversion is not in, it's a perversion of the resources, but the perversion is in the human approach and our misunderstand, like our capitalistic focus on exploitation rather than having like an eco-oriented, mindful, non-human, other covenant approach.
That's
Okay.
brilliant. Thank you so much. So I think that gets us into another question that somebody's posed in the chat, which I think is a really good one, and then we'll maybe move on to the next part of your presentation. And I think this is perfect because it speaks exactly to a project that I know you have worked on. So the question is, any thoughts on decolonization in relation to the recent Western emphasis on sustainability? And I know that this is something that you think about all the time and have done a project on. And the moves made towards thinking about life cycles and ecologies. So do you mind talking to us a little bit about the project that you did around sustainability in Nigeria and coming up with yeah.
I'll preface this by saying that, like, I used to describe my work a lot, and in this project it's present because it was a public project, but I used to use the word sustainability a lot in my work. But there's so much like flattening of that term that happens. And I think that this is also what the person was kind of getting at with the question about the Western use of sustainability. When people are talking about sustainability, they're not like, it's also too, like, a lot of it is ignoring the whole ecosystem, and it does my head in. There's like the regular greenwashing, which is like, this shirt is made out of plastic bottles, right? But that was already a practice that was already happening, right? Of people using recycled bottles to make polyfibers, and then, so it's not bringing us any closer to anywhere that we're going. It's just marketing and this capitalism focus of like, yes, how are we going to make the most money out of this? But a lot of what is ignored is the other aspects of sustainability, the human sustainability aspect, the cultural sustainability aspect. Let me see if I can get this up for you right now. So for my MFA, my final project that I did was about different types of sustainability and making sustainability in like all, right, in all of those aspects. Let's see if we can get this. Yeah. Sustainability in all of those forms and aspects, what we think about. So environmental sustainability just being one aspect, social sustainability being another. So like, how are people treating their workers, right? And this is also like, you could call it an economic sustainability thing as well, because people can't live like that. Like, people cannot exist and thrive and still be able to produce on all these things under the dire situations that especially late capitalism puts people in. And the cultural sustainability aspect, I really believe that, like, so I have a conflict with the kind of culture of luxury around sustainability. And maybe this is a bit of a social aspect too, but it's like, if the so-called sustainable thing is still asking everyone to thrive, or to try to reach, like, it's marketed in this very sexy way, right? That's asking people to still try to reach for excess, to reach for a class lifestyle that makes it inevitable that some people will have less, then in so many ways it's not sustainable, right? It's not sustainable for the culture, it's not sustainable for well-being. So during this project, I worked with a couple of brands in Nigeria, looking at their practices. I really wanted to demystify for people some of the things that are thought of as like really far away, or sustainability seen as this big, I don't know. I think especially in the global South, like this very difficult thing, but it's also something that we're doing all the time. So this was basically a rebrand project in a lot of ways, right? Thinking about all the different ways that different brands move towards that. And I think also really being aspirational too. Like there was, for me, this conversation about labor equity that just kept coming up with different designers and different brands, and being interested in how maybe they're trying to push against their their status, or the elitism and the exploitation of their workers. And I also, again, because marketing plan, like, or rebranding thing, rebranding project, linked this to like a lot of what the UN identified as quote unquote UN sustainable development goals. But this was really something that for me was focused on trying to get people to shift into a collective mindset. There's like a risk for a lot of the designers, right? To talk openly. And I feel like Lagos is the belly of the beast. Like trust is such a rare currency in that space. Like there's this constant fear of exploitation, because it is kind of like neoliberal dystopia. And it took, I think it was just like such a extension of trust for them to give me an inside view of their projects, and also allow me to share it temporarily inside the public space. But so much about that, and so much about how I think about sustainability now, is way more about entangled ways of being and networks and these livelihoods that we've had before as indigenous people, collectivist instead of individualist ways of existing in the world. And I think those values are still present for us as Nigerians in these different and subtle ways. But there's that fight and that creep of kind of Western neoliberalism that is, and the scarcity that is, it has created in our country, kind of making these things more divisive. But ultimately, it's about rethinking our sense of value, right?
And that, I think that works exactly with, I was thinking about when you're talking about theorizing the worker as part of the production process explicitly.
Right.
When Marx talks about the labor theory of value, part of what he speaks on is the ways in which the object, the commodity, incorporates what he says, the blood, brain, sinew, and nerve of the worker. And I think that really actually potentially, in his view, that's where the quote unquote value of the labor process under capitalism comes from, right? Is that extra basically part of the body, in a sense, that physical contribution that the worker makes. But obviously that's something that's not acknowledged in production in a lot of different ways. So I thought that was really, really wonderful.
And I think there's like this thing about the separation, despite that, like despite all these parts of the worker, of the producer that go into the object, the separation, whether it be through, like, especially through mass production, right? Where it's like, this is just a thing, I have no investment in it except for my check. And forcing people to be inside that mindset and that process is also pushing this separate, like the subject object divide separation. and I think one of the things that really bothers me, I've only seen very few designers, very few African designers and very few sustainable designers kind of accomplish some solutions to this. It really does my head in when I think about, like, I look at the people who are making the thing and think about the fact that they cannot afford to buy the thing that they're making. These are the, like, what is the hell is going on here? For me in inside that production process. And I think ultimately that's what, in my perfect world of sustainability and all these things, this thing that's not a, like, psychologically or an emotionally sustainable space to be in. And you also lose so much of this kind of, like, intuitive or learned tactile knowledge of being committed to that object. And people like that you see in so-called, like, artisans or craftspersons, I feel like a lot of times that's used as a derogatory term, so that's why I put it in air quotes. But this connection to the materiality, this reverence, this stillness with the materiality changes the ecology of the right, of this non-human thing, of this, like, object. It totally changes it, and it changes what matters when people are making it and the kind of considerations that are taken into place.
Okay, brilliant. Did you have another, maybe let's move on if you have
Yeah, I was just
we can take more questions.
Yeah, those were both the questions, right? I feel like.
Yeah.
Sweet. Sure. So yeah, thinking about subjectivity. Oh, so the example that I always give people about how assumptions about subjectivity play a role in design is with my iPhone. I don't know where it is right now, but the iPhone, right? Like, if you have an iPhone, then you know that, like, you can only have one, what are they called? Like iCloud IDs signed in at a time on an iPhone. And now with the biometric data on the iPhone, like, I haven't tried to put other people's fingerprints, but, like, it's assuming that it's just, or yeah, well, the face thing now, right? It's assuming now they've put in an alternative, like, you can add a second face because of COVID and, like, people masking up and things like that. They want your phone to still recognize you, but it's just one face for the face recognition on iPhone to open up your phone. And I like to give people that example because I'm like, wow, they really assumed from the beginning that I am just one person that's going to use this phone. That is just me. And there's such a deep assumption with that about individualism and our use of technology, where, like, in a lot of places, whether it be because of economics, like status slash also them being more collectivist societies than the West assumes people to be, or assumes people should be, like being more integrated with one another and being more collectivist. Yeah, you can have a phone or a family that has a phone together, right? That has been me in several situations where, like, me and my mom share a phone, and so an iPhone wouldn't work. It's like, how do I, or you know what I mean? Like, how does it work if it's really just assuming that I am this individual subject and I see myself as an individualized subject? And that's kind of what is this thing? Hold on. What I want to talk about with this next little deck of slides. Also feel free to, like, interject, Aimée, whenever.
I mean, I'm really love this, and I think but with the biometrics and so on. It made me think of Parasite, actually.
Oh,
You
wow.
know, that film, where they're sharing like the Wi-Fi, and they have a collective phone. I think they do actually have a collective phone.
Mm.
That,
Yeah, they do. That's
yeah,
right, actually. Yeah.
yeah.
So this is this, for lack of a better term, hell on earth tool, persona mapping that uh, in like human-centered design and all these things, like when you're in design school now, unfortunately, because the curriculums are not decolonized, this is what you're taught that you should use to make a good design. And the idea is that you make a persona, like it's like an archetype for this person and who they are. You see here, like, who is she? How did she find us? What are the pain points? So you're basically meant to, and you can kind of see it, like create a buyer. You're basically meant to hack this person's this individual subjectivity and their life and the journey of their life, and figure out how you can like lodge your product in there to make money. People, I think that like the pitch or the idea was that like, yes, this makes us more empathetic. Like now we're coming at consumers in such a way that we understand their wants and needs. But I'm like, also you're coming at them as consumers, right? First off, before we go anywhere, right? You're coming at them as consumers. So you're thinking about, this is like the Homo economicus thing, like the idea of man's existence or human beings' existence now in late capitalism as it being supposed to be something that's about capital, and like how you can get capital in different forms, how you can use your capital in different forms, but the core of your humanity being the fact that you can exchange and gain capital. And so this is what we're meant to use and meant to hack. And when I was doing my MFA, we'll get into that more later, but when I was doing my MFA, one of my light bulbs was like, I can't use this. Like if I'm really trying to decolonize, I don't want to use this design method that is continuing to promote people seeing themselves as individuals and as individualistic, right? Because that's like the race versus racism part. Like you're an individual, but the centering and the worshiping of like individualism is so present to this in my mind, and I really feel like it's not questioned enough how much this design process is, this design methodology is constantly reproducing these assumptions about the fact that people should exist as individualistically minded folks. And there's something that I wanted to say. Okay, maybe I'll find it later. But there's this project that I really love because I feel like it's a great example of the fact that the universalization of this idea of humans as individuals doesn't apply to all cultures and doesn't apply necessarily to the subjectivities that exist inside of indigenous knowledge. Oh, this is what I was gonna say that I forgot. So one of the first times actually that I was first thinking about this was way before my MFA. I was a PhD student at UCSD, and we were working with Somali refugees inside of San Diego. So we were working inside these family communities with children and their mothers. And we were creating this intervention that was looking at and thinking about mental health. And we asked them about different things. One of the things that really came up as a space of intergenerational trauma was the cell phone use, and this feeling that their children were enculturating into an individualistic way of seeing the world when they themselves are right? Our culturally collectivist society. And it was really interesting too to see like the different things that we landed on. Like we asked both the children and the mothers, like our intervention plan was to be on a mobile device, and we wanted to know whether they wanted to have that mobile device be like a cell phone, something that they could do by, it's going to be a tablet actually, but something that they would do by themselves. Like, okay, the mothers sit down and they go through this experience that is our kind of intervention with regards to intergenerational trauma, that they would sit down as parents and do it, and then the children would sit down and do it. Or did they want it to be an experience that the whole family would sit down together and do? And we had the overwhelming response, not just from the parents, the mothers, but also from the children, was that they wanted this to be a collective activity. And that's something that really surprised me, but it also was the beginning of me and the design team together really thinking about redefining what is user, because in this space, user is a collective, is a collective entity, it's not individuals. But yeah, so this project is from Pet Lamp. They do really wonderful things with weaving and the design of light pieces through using weaving and using plastic bottles. And so they were in a part of Australia, I can't remember where they were working with indigenous people, Aboriginal people, and they decided that the final product of their lamp was actually going to be like a cosmograph or like a family tree type of thing, showing everyone's connection to each other. So all the lamps that each person would weave would be brought together in relation to each other and showing how they connect to one another, which I think is just in and of itself a really beautiful idea. So this is like the sketch, this planning sketch of like identifying these different kinships. And here you see everyone weaving their lamp that will then go together. And you can see the plastic bottles at the. And so this is the final product, the final like outcome of this like, I don't know, co-created design thing. But if you look at the diagram of it, and they chart all these different types of kinship and people's like stewardships and things like that, what totems they have stewardship to, or what they're attached to, and like how they're connected. If you look closely, there's an extra one. This person is here twice, right? Mary. And that is because Mary is a twin. And so Mary, as a twin and as an indigenous subject, seeing herself as an indigenous subject, does not see herself as a singular, as an individual, right? She sees herself as always doubled and always dual. She's always representing her twin with herself. Like her twin is a part of herself. And therefore she couldn't, like not include, if she's going to represent herself, or there's going to be a lamp that represents her, there's going to be two. And I feel like that's just such a profound example of the way that like contemporary assumptions in design about subjectivity and who subjects are and how they think of themselves, and therefore even what they need and how they want those things to be designed for them, is such a failure. Like it misses so much. I played with this a little bit, or one of my projects exploring this is this clothing design project focused on the Yoruba subjectivity of Abiku, which is this liminal entity that is simultaneously kind of and precariously existing and trying to navigate the world of the living and the heavens, and is constantly in this push and pull back and forth of whether to stay on earth or go to the world of spirits. And for me, it's like, the question really is like, what, not the ideal, not like the ideal romanticism of, if I was making something that was for an abiku to feel clothed, what would it be? The question for me is not that question inside the context of if colonialism never happened, right? And I think that that is an important distinction, is that to me, decolonization is the movement away from colonialism into the worlds that we want to build, not this kind of fantastic or ideal romantic imagination of, if it never happened, I would do this, right? Because in this case, if I was making something Frana Abiku without like colonialism ever happening, I might just be like, okay, well, it doesn't need clothes. This subject doesn't need clothes at all. But it's really thinking about, how do we design for that transition? How do we design for that mediation between what we have now and what we're assuming is okay now and what we would like to see? And so in this work, a lot of my research and a lot of my focus was on personal narrative, but also about the idea of queering, and the idea queering subjectivity, and also about how this subjectivity might help us understand something like disability in a different mindset, right? Where racist ableism says that if you are disabled, in quotes, if your body is differently abled, you are a failed subject, right? You are a failed capitalistic subject, you are a failed colonial subject, whatever. And really wanting to move away from that constantly, and trying to think about like how this goes back to what I was saying about pain and grief and trauma, right? That is also seen as a failure of subjectivity. We can talk about all the reasons why that is, right? If you're in pain, maybe if you focus on your pain, or you allow your grief, or you're present with your grief, then you're not as good of a cog in the machine. And also for those who benefit from oppressive systems, if they access that space of pain and trauma and grief, then they're no longer, like, it becomes impossible to continue to be complicit if you really feel with, if you really engage that pain and trauma and grief, and exist with it, then the system will collapse, right? So I'm really interested in, at once, like the so-called like the things that make us failures, basically, in capitalistic and neo-colonial imaginings of who the subject is supposed to be, and also pushing for a less universal assumption of subjectivity inside of design.
Okay, so I'm just gonna come in with a technical point. We have reached, we've been scheduled for an hour, yes. I don't know how you're feeling, Mukhtara, and how you want to carry on or not, or, I mean, I think I'm happy to stay for a few more minutes if you want to continue conversation, or not. It feels like we've touched on a lot of things.
I'm down to keep chatting for a bit. I feel like there are a few questions and things that I know that you wanted to ask me. So maybe we could touch on like one or two of those things.
Yeah, maybe I'll ask one follow-up question. And okay. There's been some amazing contributions as well in the chat, which have been really helpful. So I'll save the chat and maybe I'll send it to you after if you want to use that potentially in informing your work, or something like that. Just as like a housekeeping thing, I just want to point everyone again to this the second event in our event series that is going to go on tomorrow evening from 5 p.m. GMT, so 5 p.m. Greenwich Meridian time. Thank you. And that is on international solidarity from Black Lives Matter in Ferguson to Palestine to Hong Kong. And so we have some really amazing international guests. So if you are interested in that, I will put the link in the chat again. And you are invited to share that with your networks or share that with anyone you think would be interested in that, because we still have some spaces and I would really like to get some amazing attendance for that, just like we've seen tonight. Thank you all for coming. And yeah, I'll ask one follow-up question, I suppose. What do you think of the ways in which we can potentially oppose a shallow kind of decolonized washing of institutions? How do you think we ought to potentially respond to that, with the understanding also that we are not capable, as you've said, there's a kind of imminent relationship. We can't just kind of step outside of the institutions that exist, but how do we potentially embed a different way of being, and how do we respond when institutions potentially kind of just try to decolonize, wash? I mean, we've just been seeing so much of that this year, I think, which in some ways is good, and in other ways maybe troubling. Yes, and we'll share the recording afterwards with everybody.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, like, I feel like it's more of troubling than it is good. Yeah. If I'm completely honest, that's like my initial response or perspective, because decolonizing is not a representational project. Yeah. And I hope that this is something that people also sense and feel from like what of my work I've shared so far. It's not representational. It's not. I remember I had a really dark, racist, ableist experience in my MFA design program. Dealt with a lot of racist ableism and a lot of xenophobia that I really sense was because I was like ready to die on the hill of decolonizing, right? And not just being such an offense to the way that people are used to doing things inside of academia, to the lack of like accomplices inside of academic space, and this focus on like survivalism, like people trying to survive, or feeling like, okay, well, yeah, if I don't know, whatever, I'm having this thing with my tenure, or I'm scared that this is going to happen. I might not get approved for full professorship if I decide to go to bat for this marginalized person. And so one, it not being representational, like it has to be an ecological project. And I think there is like, for me, it's just like ramming it over the head again and again and again within these institutional spaces that, like, a friend said to me, because I said I was really frustrated during my MFA. It was incredibly difficult, incredibly like traumatic, negative experience. And I was talking to a friend and I was telling her like, yeah, you know, but I'm so confused because I came in saying what I was going to do, that I'm a decolonizing designer and all this stuff. And she said, she made this like representation joke. So I was like, yeah, and like they're still expecting me to give them like the design equivalent of chicken nuggets from Mickey D's, right? And she was like, yeah. But the thing is, when you told them that like, yo, I'm Nigerian, like my work focuses on indigenous sovereignty and things about Nigeria and our relationships to non-humans and nature, they thought, oh, okay, well, she's not going to give us chicken nuggets. She's going to give us spicy chicken nuggets. And oh my God. And that's something that I think about a lot, because I think that people think that decolonization is like using a different color swatch to things, or like, or putting Dutch wax on something and like, yes, yay. But it's the same version of the same thing, right? And it's also just a reproduction. So yeah, I really think that a lot of it is going to be us organizing, and trying to mediate inside that space, kind of what I was saying about the ideal. And I also think like, and this is maybe something that's bad to say, I've gotten very, very okay with the idea of failure in these institutions, you know, because I'm like, the institution is failing you. So do you measure your sense of success based on whether the institution is making this toxic space habitable for you? No, right? We continue to mobilize and we continue to work and we continue to push against, and we do maybe things that we think we need to do for our basic well-being and sustaining, but we can't ever get too comfortable, I think. And that's usually, I think, where it's like the thing is dead in the water. It's like when you get too comfortable and you get into this idea of, well, I just have to survive inside this institution, especially in academia, and you're no longer willing to be an accomplice or an advocate or someone who's pushing against a lot of these colonialist epistemologies inside of academia.
Okay, that's amazing. I think we maybe should wrap up, but there is one last question that I thought was quite interesting and important. So I'll ask it, which is the decolonization of a culture just a process approached by the specific colonized people, or is it something approached by all other colonized people or all people? I mean, I have thoughts on this myself reading that, but
yeah, I want you to go first.
really, I mean, I suppose my thought is colonization, like colonialism itself, is a global project and an international project. And so decolonization has to kind of inherently be a global project in the same vein, because these processes, you know, the kind of markets that were created by colonialism, the ways in which certain cultures came into contact with each other through colonialism, to me, create kind of these global assemblages that in thinking through decoloniality, we have to then reckon with the ways our own history is placed into contact with other cultures and with political events, and with these histories that kind of span the globe. So that's my thinking on that matter.
I think just your perspective in saying that, I have two feelings about this, right? Because I can think of it as like this, I have kind of a split mind of this question when I think about the United States versus Nigeria. So in the US, there is a conversation that's growing about this space, the role of Blackness inside of settler colonialism. And I would say not just the United States, actually all of North America. When we try to use the term settler colonialist and like flatten it in the US, in the context of the US, then we miss the aspect of like, yes, these people are occupying indigenous land, but they're occupying indigenous land because they were literally kidnapped, forcibly brought here, and made to be stewards of this land without any compensation, and through the horrors and the traumas of chattel slavery. And then on the other hand, actually, I think in a way this all is like, I'm thinking so much about colonialism and anti-Black racism together and their relationship together, right? So there's a way by which those two like sync up into turbo mode, and they're not separate, like you can't really separate them. So then in the case of talking about settler colonialism within North America, you have to think about that. And then in the case in Nigeria, we have settlers, like settler colonialists inside of Nigeria. For example, we have a large Indian Nigerian population that has been there for a very long time. Some of, you know, I personally know at least one family that has been there for 100 years, since 1920. And yet, these people are not just migrants, they're settler colonialists in the sense that they actively perpetuate and benefit, not everybody, right, but certain classes within this group, and as a larger group of colonized people inside another colonized people's indigenous land, promote, project, benefit from, curate, whatever you want to call it, continue, reproduce anti-Black racism within the country, right? So that makes me like really think about like indigeneity as something that's very, very important, and how our relationships to like other colonized entities are not so clean as, okay, you're colonized and you're over there, and I'm colonized and I'm over here. We're both colonized by the British, this one, that one, the other thing, right? It's not as clean as that. There's also this continuation and perpetuation of like an anti-Black racist colonialism and settler colonialism that makes it a decolonization of a culture. I'm like, I don't want any, like, what do these settler colonialists who also happen to have are from a colonized nation have to do with me decolonizing my culture, right? Like there's like, I have this in my head, this big like hands-off thing about it. Yeah, so I think it's specific in those types of instances, but we're either aiding other colonized people in their decolonization, or or we're creating obstacles towards it. And I think ultimately that is the question, like, how are we relating, rather than, yeah, glomming it together as something we can definitely all do together in the same way, right, for each other. So,
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And I will just thank you, Mukhtara, for joining us.
I want to put my contact inside of the chat